Madison stepped out of the gleaming black, her designer heels clicking against the cobblestones of London's historic streets. At 17, she had never known a day without luxury. Her father owned a chain of successful tech companies across 3 countries, and her mother was a prominent socialite who graced magazine covers regularly. Madison's world revolved around getting whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted it. The summer trip to London was supposed to be educational, according to her parents, but Madison saw it as just another opportunity to show off her wealth and superiority. She wore a custom-made dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary, carried a handbag worth thousands of dollars, and spoke with the entitled tone of someone who had never been told no. Her entourage consisted of 3 friends from her exclusive private school, all equally spoiled and used to getting their way through daddy's money. They giggled and pointed at everything around them, treating the historic city like their personal playground. Madison led the group with confidence, her phone constantly buzzing with notifications from her millions of social media followers who hung on her every posted moment. "This place is so old and boring," Madison declared loudly as they approached Palace. "I don't understand why people make such a big deal about this dusty old building. Our house in Beverly Hills is way more impressive." Her friends nodded in agreement, though secretly some of them were actually impressed by the grandeur of the palace. They had learned long ago that disagreeing with Madison was not worth the drama that would follow. Madison thrived on attention and validation, and she made sure everyone around her knew exactly how important she believed herself to be. As they walked through the crowd of tourists, Madison noticed people staring at her expensive outfit and jewelry. She loved the attention and made sure to walk in a way that would draw even more eyes. Her bodyguard, hired by her parents for the trip, followed at a respectful distance, shaking his head slightly at her behavior but staying professional. The group approached the famous red-uniformed guards standing at attention outside the palace gates. Madison had heard about these guards before but had never seen them in person. She was immediately struck by how still and serious they looked, standing like statues in their traditional uniforms with their tall black hats. "Oh my God, look at these guys," she said loudly, pointing directly at one of the guards. "They're like real-life toy soldiers. Do they actually do anything, or do they just stand there looking stupid all day?" Several tourists turned to look at her with disapproving expressions, but Madison didn't care. She was used to saying whatever came to mind without considering how it might affect others. Her friends giggled nervously, sensing that something about this situation felt different from their usual antics. The guard she was pointing at was a young man named James, though the tourists didn't know his name. He had served in the British Army for 5 years before earning his position as one of the Queen's guards. It was an honor that required exceptional discipline, dedication, and respect for tradition. He had been standing at his post for 2 hours already, maintaining perfect posture despite the heat and the constant stream of tourists. James had dealt with rude tourists before, but something about this girl's tone and attitude struck him as particularly disrespectful. Still, he remained motionless, his training taking over as he focused straight ahead, refusing to react to her taunts. Madison stepped closer to the guard, emboldened by what she saw as his inability to respond. She had grown up believing that people who couldn't fight back were weak, and she had developed a habit of pushing boundaries whenever she encountered someone she thought couldn't defend themselves. "Hello, tin soldier," she called out, waving her hand in front of his face. "Can you hear me in there, or are you just a really good mannequin?" The crowd around them began to murmur, with many people looking uncomfortable at her behavior. Parents pulled their children closer, and several tourists started taking out their phones to record what was happening. Madison, however, was too caught up in her own performance to notice the changing mood around her. Her bodyguard stepped forward slightly, recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond what was appropriate. "Miss Madison, perhaps we should move along to see other parts of the palace," he suggested quietly. But Madison waved him off dismissively. She was enjoying the attention too much to stop now. In her mind, she was entertaining the crowd and showing everyone how fearless and important she was. She had no understanding of the disrespect she was showing to a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country. "I bet you're dying to move, aren't you?" she continued, moving even closer to James. "It must be so boring just standing there like a statue. Don't you want to talk to someone as interesting and beautiful as me?" James felt his jaw tighten slightly, but years of training kept him perfectly still. He had sworn an oath to maintain his dignity and composure no matter what happened during his duties. He thought about his grandfather, who had served as a guard decades earlier and had taught him about the honor and responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. Madison's friends began to feel genuinely uncomfortable as they noticed the hostile looks they were getting from other tourists. They tried to signal to Madison that maybe she should stop, but she was completely absorbed in her performance. She had always been the center of attention in her social circle, and she wasn't about to give up that position now. "Maybe if I give you some money, you'll break character," Madison said with a cruel smile, pulling out a wad of cash from her expensive purse. "How much do they pay you to stand there like an idiot? I probably make more money in a day than you make in a year." She waved the money in front of James's face, not realizing that she had just crossed a line that would change everything. The crowd around them had grown larger, with people stopping to watch what was happening. Many of them looked disgusted by her behavior, but Madison misread their attention as admiration. James continued to stare straight ahead, but inside he was making a decision. He had endured insults before, but this level of disrespect toward his service and his uniform was something he couldn't let pass without response. His training had taught him that there were appropriate ways to handle situations like this while still maintaining his dignity and upholding the honor of his position. The stage was set for a confrontation that would teach Madison a lesson she would never forget, and show the watching crowd what real strength and character looked like when faced with ignorance and disrespect. The crowd around Madison and the guard had grown significantly larger. People were pulling out their phones, sensing that something dramatic was about to happen. Madison was completely oblivious to the tension building around her, lost in her own world of entitlement and attention-seeking behavior. "Come on, toy soldier," Madison taunted, now standing directly in front of James. "I know you can hear me. Are you really going to just ignore someone as important as me? Do you know who my father is? He could probably buy this entire palace if he wanted to." She reached out and actually poked the guard's uniform with her perfectly manicured finger, leaving a small smudge on the pristine red fabric. The gasp from the crowd was audible. Several people called out for her to stop, but Madison was too drunk on her own sense of power to listen. James felt the poke against his chest, and something inside him shifted. Years of military training had taught him discipline, but they had also taught him when action was necessary. This spoiled teenager had crossed every line of basic human decency, and now she had physically touched him while he was performing his sacred duty. Madison's friends finally found the courage to speak up. "Madison, maybe we should go," whispered Sarah, one of her closest friends. "People are starving and not in a good way." But Madison spun around with fury in her eyes. "Don't you dare tell me what to do," she snapped. "I'm having fun with this pathetic excuse for a soldier. If he doesn't like it, he can quit his stupid job and find something better to do with his life." She turned back to James, who remained perfectly still, though those watching carefully might have noticed his jaw tightening slightly. Madison was completely unaware that she was pushing a highly trained military professional past his breaking point. "I bet you've never seen this much money in your life," Madison continued, waving her cash closer to his face. "Maybe I should just stick it in your hat as a tip, for entertaining me by standing there like a complete idiot." That was the moment James decided he had heard enough. But instead of breaking character or losing his temper, he did something completely unexpected. With military precision and perfect timing, he began to move. The movement was so sudden and coordinated that Madison jumped backward in surprise. But James wasn't breaking his post or abandoning his duty. Instead, he was demonstrating exactly why the Queen's Guards were chosen from among the most elite soldiers in the British military. With movements so sharp and precise they seemed almost mechanical, James executed a perfect about-face maneuver. His boots clicked together with such force that the sound echoed through the courtyard. Then, without warning, he began to march directly toward Madison, his face still maintaining the same stoic expression, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Madison's confidence evaporated instantly. The reality of facing a 6-foot-tall, highly trained soldier in full military bearing suddenly hit her like a cold wave. She stumbled backward, her expensive heels catching on the cobblestones, nearly causing her to fall. "Get out of the way," James commanded in a voice that carried the full authority of the British military. It wasn't a request or a suggestion. It was an order delivered with such conviction that everyone within hearing distance immediately understood that this was not a game. The crowd that had been watching Madison's performance suddenly found themselves witnessing something entirely different. This wasn't a statue coming to life for entertainment purposes. This was a professional soldier executing his duty to maintain order and protect the dignity of his post. Madison tried to stand her ground, but her voice cracked as she spoke. "You can't talk to me like that. I'm an American citizen. I have rights." James continued his march without pause, forcing Madison to step backward with each step he took. His presence was overwhelming, and for the first time in her life, Madison found herself face to face with someone who was completely unimpressed by her wealth, her status, or her demands for special treatment. "You will move away from the guard post immediately," James stated firmly, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "You will show proper respect for this location and for the uniform I wear in service to the crown." Madison's friends had already backed away, recognizing that their wealthy friend had finally encountered someone who wouldn't be intimidated by her father's money or her social media followers. Her bodyguard stepped forward, but not to protect Madison from the guard. Instead, he gently took her arm and tried to guide her away from the confrontation. "Miss Madison, we need to leave now," the bodyguard said urgently. He was a former military man himself and recognized the authority in James's voice. He also understood that Madison had put herself in a position where she had no choice but to retreat. But Madison's pride wouldn't let her back down gracefully. She had built her entire identity around getting her way and making others bend to her will. The idea that a mere guard could force her to do anything was incomprehensible to her privileged mind. "No way," she declared, though her voice shook slightly. "I'm not moving until he apologizes for being rude to me. Don't you know who I am? My family could have you fired from your stupid job." James stopped his march exactly 3 feet in front of Madison, close enough that she could see every detail of his uniform, from the perfectly polished buttons to the immaculate condition of his weapon. When he spoke again, his voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge of authority. "Young lady, you are currently interfering with a member of Her Majesty's Guard in the performance of his duties. You have shown disrespect to the crown, to the uniform, and to the traditions of this nation. You will step away immediately or face the consequences of your actions." The crowd around them had gone completely silent. Even Madison's friends were holding their breath, finally understanding that their friend had pushed things too far. Madison looked around desperately for support, but found only disapproving faces and people recording her humiliation on their phones. For the first time in her 17 years of privileged life, Madison was learning what it felt like to face real consequences for her actions. And the lesson was just beginning. Madison stood frozen in place, her mind racing as she tried to process what was happening. For the first time in her life, someone had not only refused to give her what she wanted, but had actually challenged her authority. The guard's commanding presence was unlike anything she had ever experienced, and she could feel her confidence crumbling with each passing second. The crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle had grown to nearly 100 people. Tourists from around the world stood mesmerized, watching this confrontation between entitled privilege and disciplined service. Many of them were recording the encounter, already imagining how viral this moment would become on social media. James maintained his position exactly 3 feet from Madison, his posture perfect, his gaze unwavering. Years of military training had taught him how to project authority without aggression, how to command respect through presence alone. He could see that the spoiled teenager was finally beginning to understand the gravity of her situation. "I said move," James repeated, his voice cutting through the silence like a sword. "You have 30 seconds to comply with this lawful order." Madison's lower lip began to tremble slightly. She looked desperately at her friends, hopping for support, but they had already taken several steps back. Her bodyguard moved closer, recognizing that his client was in real trouble and needed to extract herself from this situation immediately. "Miss Madison," the bodyguard whispered urgently, "please listen to me. We need to apologize and leave right now. This is not a situation you can win." But Madison's pride was still fighting against her growing fear. She had never backed down from a confrontation before, and the thought of appearing weak in front of all these people was almost unbearable. Her entire identity was built around being untouchable, above the rules that applied to ordinary people. 20 seconds, James announced, his voice echoing across the courtyard. That's when Madison made her biggest mistake yet. Instead of retreating gracefully, she decided to escalate the situation even further. Pulling out her phone, she aimed it at James and began recording. "This is going straight to my social media," she declared, trying to regain control of the narrative. 20 million followers are going to see how badly you're treating an innocent tourist. My father's lawyers will have your job by tomorrow morning. But James had anticipated this move. Without changing his expression or position, he spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Recording of military personnel on duty without permission is prohibited under Section 58 of the Terrorism Act. Surrender your device immediately or face arrest." Madison's eyes widened in shock. She had expected her threat to intimidate the guard, but instead he had responded with legal authority that she didn't understand and couldn't challenge. The phone trembled in her hand as she realized she was no longer in control of the situation. 10 seconds, James continued, his voice growing more commanding with each word. The crowd began to murmur among themselves. Some tourists were pulling their own children closer, sensing that they were witnessing something serious. Others continued recording, but from a respectful distance, understanding that they were documenting a moment of genuine consequence. Madison looked around frantically, searching for an escape route, but found herself surrounded by disapproving faces. For the first time, she noticed how the crowd was looking at her. Instead of admiration or envy, she saw disgust, embarrassment, and disappointment in their expressions. 5 seconds, James announced. That's when Madison finally broke. The combination of genuine fear, public humiliation, and the complete collapse of her sense of superiority overwhelmed her all at once. Her hands began to shake, and tears of frustration and confusion began to form in her eyes. "I don't understand," she stammered, her voice cracking. "This isn't how things are supposed to work. People are supposed to treat me with respect. My father always says that money talks, and we have more money than anyone." James saw the moment when Madison's facade finally cracked completely. Beneath the entitled attitude and cruel behavior, he could see what she really was. A confused, spoiled child who had never been taught how to treat other people with basic human decency. But instead of showing mercy, James decided this was the perfect moment to deliver the lesson that would change Madison's life forever. With the precision of a master teacher, he began to speak in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Young lady, let me explain something that your money cannot buy and your social media followers cannot provide," he began, his voice carrying the weight of genuine authority. "Respect is earned through character, service, and treating others with dignity. It cannot be purchased, demanded, or stolen." Madison stood transfixed, unable to look away from the guard's unwavering gaze. She had never heard anyone speak to her with such absolute conviction and moral authority. "This uniform represents something greater than any individual," James continued. "It represents duty, honor, sacrifice, and service to something beyond oneself. These are concepts that no amount of money can buy and no social media presence can replicate." The crowd around them had gone completely silent, hanging on every word. Even Madison's friends found themselves listening intently, recognizing that they were hearing something important and transformative. "You have spent the last 20 minutes demonstrating everything that is wrong with entitled privilege," James said, his voice never rising but somehow becoming more powerful. "You have shown disrespect not just to me, but to every person who serves others, to every tradition that built this nation, and to every value that makes civilization possible." Madison felt tears beginning to flow down her cheeks, but she couldn't look away. Something about the guard's words was reaching a part of her that had never been touched before, a part that had been buried under years of material excess and false superiority. "Your father's money means nothing here," James concluded. "Your social media followers cannot help you now. The only thing that matters in this moment is whether you have the character to recognize your mistakes and the courage to become a better person." The transformation in Madison was visible to everyone watching. The arrogant, entitled teenager who had arrived at the palace that morning was gone, replaced by a confused and frightened young woman who was finally beginning to understand how hollow her previous life had been. Madison stood in stunned silence, tears streaming down her face as the full weight of the guard's words settled over her. For the first time in her 17 years, someone had held up a mirror to her behavior and forced her to see herself as she really was. The reflection was not flattering. The crowd around them remained completely silent, recognizing that they were witnessing a pivotal moment. Some of the tourists who had initially been annoyed by Madison's behavior now found themselves feeling sympathy for the young woman who was clearly experiencing a profound moment of self-realization. James maintained his authoritative stance, but allowed his voice to soften slightly as he continued his lesson. The men and women who wear this uniform have dedicated their lives to something greater than themselves. We stand here not for personal glory or recognition, but because we believe in duty, honor, and service to others. Madison's makeup was ruined by her tears, and her expensive outfit suddenly seemed silly and inappropriate. She felt naked and exposed, not physically but emotionally, as if everyone could see through the facade she had built around herself. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Nobody has ever. Nobody has ever told you the truth," James finished for her. "Nobody has ever explained that real strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. That true power lies in service, not in demanding service from others." Madison's bodyguard, who had been standing quietly nearby, felt a mixture of pride and sadness as he watched his young client finally confront reality. He had served in the military himself years earlier and recognized the profound lesson being delivered by the guard. "Miss Madison," the bodyguard said gently, "this is your opportunity to show real character. Not the fake character that money can buy, but the authentic character that comes from acknowledging mistakes and choosing to do better." Madison looked around at the crowd of people who had witnessed her humiliation, but instead of seeing judgment in their faces, she began to see something else. Many of them were nodding approvingly at the guard's words, and some were looking at her with what appeared to be hope that she would choose to learn from this experience. With shaking hands, Madison slowly put away her phone and took a small step backward from the guard. The simple act of moving away from her position of confrontation felt like admitting defeat, but also like the first step toward something better. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for disrespecting you and your uniform and everything you represent. I didn't understand, but that's not an excuse. I should have known better." James nodded slightly, acknowledging her apology while maintaining his professional demeanor. "Apologies are meaningful only when followed by changed behavior," he said. "The question now is what you will do with this lesson." Madison wiped her tears with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup even further. For once in her life, she didn't care how she looked. "I don't know how to be different," she admitted. "I've never learned how to treat people properly. Everyone has always done whatever I wanted because of my family's money." "Learning begins with recognition," James replied. "You have just taken the first step by acknowledging the problem. The next steps will require courage, humility, and genuine effort to understand how your actions affect others." The crowd began to disperse slowly, many people moved by what they had witnessed. Several tourists approached Madison as they left, not to mock her, but to offer quiet words of encouragement about her ability to change and grow from this experience. An elderly British woman stopped beside Madison and spoke softly. "Dear, I've lived for 78 years, and I can tell you that the people who matter most are those who have the courage to admit when they're wrong and the strength to become better. You've just shown both qualities." Madison looked up at the woman with fresh tears in her eyes. "But how do I change? How do I become the kind of person who deserves respect instead of demanding it?" The elderly woman smiled gently. "By asking that question, you've already begun the journey. Real change happens one choice at a time, one interaction at a time, one moment of putting others before yourself at a time." As the woman walked away, Madison turned back to James, who had returned to his original position but was watching her with something that might have been approval in his eyes. "Thank you," Madison said simply. "I know you didn't have to teach me anything. You could have just had me arrested or thrown out. But you gave me something much more valuable than punishment. You gave me a chance to become better." James nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement that meant more to Madison than any praise she had ever received on social media. Then, with military precision, he returned to his duty stance, becoming once again the perfectly disciplined guardian of tradition and honor. Madison's friends approached cautiously, unsure of what to say to their transformed companion. Madison looked at them with new eyes, seeing for the first time how their friendship was built on shared privilege rather than genuine care for each other. "I need to call my parents," Madison said quietly. "I need to tell them what happened here and ask them to help me understand how to be a better person. And I think I need to do some volunteer work when I get home to learn what it feels like to serve others instead of expecting to be served." As the group walked away from Palace, Madison turned back once more to look at the guard who had changed her life. James remained at his post, a symbol of everything she now realized she wanted to become: strong, principled, dedicated to something greater than herself. The spoiled teenager who had arrived at the palace that morning was gone forever, replaced by a young woman who finally understood the difference between demanding respect and earning it. The lesson had been painful and public, but it had also been transformative in a way that would echo through the rest of her life. 6 months later, Madison would establish a foundation dedicated to teaching young people about service and character. She would never forget the day a Queen's Guard taught her that true strength comes not from wealth or status, but from the courage to serve others and the wisdom to put duty before personal desire. The tourists who witnessed that confrontation would share the story for years to come, not as an example of public humiliation, but as proof that it's never too late to learn, grow, and choose to become better than you were before.